Hey there, Global Crew. This is Richmond coming to you with our second online lesson in this lovely time of quarantine. I'm actually going to turn the video in the corner off today for two reasons. One, because we're actually going to be looking at a lot of really important artwork today, and I think you're going to want to see the bigger picture. And secondly, I have neither shaved nor showered in some time, so I don't want to scare any of you away. So we're just going to leave that camera off for right now. So, hey, today we're going to be talking about the beginnings of this new period of time in European history that we're going to call the Renaissance. So, we're going to be pushing out of the Middle Ages. We're going to see something that's very different, very unique. And we'll talk about what that means because it's going to mean a lot of different things. And we'll be looking at what that actually means between this week and next week. So, we'll continue to finish up this week on the Renaissance, but also look at a couple of things next week on it as well. So our two big guiding questions for today. Number one, what was this thing that we call the commercial revolution and how did it change Europe's economy? So we're going to be talking a little bit about money before we get into this idea of the Renaissance. And then secondly, what is meant by the Renaissance and why did it begin in places like Italy? So let's jump right in. I'm going to try and make this video much shorter than the last one, but we'll see. So remember, last time we talked about those crusades, we talked about the bubonic plague. I mean, we mentioned a lot of different pieces to what was going on towards the end of the Middle Ages because it's moving Europe forward. Remember, the crusades were really a big turning point for European history. It starts this process of trade for Europe, where all of a sudden on the Mediterranean Sea, we're going to see a lot of trade going back and forth between a couple specific areas that we'll mention today and the Middle East because they wanted some of the goods and some of the luxuries that they found over there. The Crusades really also allowed the Europeans to become far more interested in much more Muslim ideas. So remember, the Muslims at this time were in their golden age, or at least they were coming out of it. They were much more advanced in art and math and sciences, a lot of old Greek and Roman stuff that had been kind of carried over. So the Muslims knew their things, and the Europeans, by contrast, remember they were pretty backwards for a while. They're much more concerned about just their safety and security. So now when these Muslims have all these new ideas, they're going to welcome them. And then also keep in mind too that once the Black Death tears through, and remember the Black Death takes down as much as half of Europe's population, and it really does push Europe away from religion. Now that doesn't mean that they all become atheists because they definitely don't. What it does mean is that all of a sudden religion is not going to be as important as it used to be. There's a much bigger emphasis on the here and the now and live life for today instead of always worrying about what's going to happen with heaven later on. So it's going to change how people think and act, but that doesn't mean that religion is going to disappear entirely. We still have some pretty important religious history that will be moving forward in the next few weeks. So with the Crusades, again, remember all these crusaders are coming back to Europe from the Middle East and they want all these new things. They want all these luxuries and trade goods. And so as trade increases with the Middle East and with Asia, Europe began to become more and more wealthy. I mean, you start doing more trade, people are making money, merchants are going to become wealthier, things like that. So what we start to see in Europe is this new group of people. Now, if you remember from the Middle Ages, we had the higher ups, we had the nobles, and then we had the peasants. The majority of people would have been peasants, and they would just sort of like live off the land and be poor. So really in the Middle Ages, you only have two social classes, the nobility and the peasantry, and really the church if you wanted to count them too, but they're pretty high up there. So now what we start to see is this thing that we call the middle class. That's going to be mostly businessmen, merchants, craftsmen. So why do we call this the middle class? Well, they're not as wealthy as the nobility, but they're not as poor as the peasants. So they exist in like this little middle area. And this is going to be pretty important, especially as countries become more and more modern, they become more and more advanced. The idea of a middle class is going to be much more important. It's certainly something that we pride ourselves a lot on in the United States. Not everybody's Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, but at the same time, not everyone's poor. We like this idea of having a strong middle class in our country today. And so this is something that we start to see in European countries during this time. At the same time as all of this is going down, we also start to see these things called guilds. And a guild, those of you who are gamers, you're probably pretty familiar with this term guild in the sense that, you maybe have a group of people that get together and they play games together or something like that. And that sense of community is important, but guild in a historical sense is a little bit different. A guild would be an organization of tradesmen and craftsmen that would help to oversee quality and pricing of goods. So essentially, it would be all these different business owners or all these different tradesmen, these craftsmen, people who make stuff, and they would get together within a particular town and they would talk about how they can make things better. So they would sometimes set prices, they would set the hours that somebody could work, how goods were made, and things like that. And very often, if let's say we're a bunch of coopers, we're a bunch of barrel makers. If we've got a couple barrels or a couple barrel makers rather that aren't really up to quality, they're making bad barrels. Well, that might make us all look bad. I mean, if people come to our town to buy barrels and there's a chance that they might get really crappy ones, well, we all have a vested interest to make sure that that person stops making crappy barrels. So let's all work together and make a better product. So guilds are really going to start to help to increase the quality of goods and also the quantity of goods, because now we're doing a whole lot more trade. And something important is going to develop out of this. We're very slowly going to see a brand new economic system. Remember, anytime we're talking about economies, we're always talking about how goods are exchanged. So we're talking about, sometimes money, but also just how do resources get where they need to go. And so what we start to see during this time is this thing that we today call capitalism. It's a very early form of capitalism at this stage. Capitalism itself won't really take off until until the 1700s. But capitalism is sort of this idea that people should be able to create businesses and make money for themselves. So I can start a business and I can profit from that business. I don't necessarily have to turn over all of my profit, all of my money to a lord or to my government. Now, certainly taxes are a thing. But again, it's this idea of profit. I want to make money. So capitalism is based pretty heavily on this idea that you show your wealth using money. I mean, before that, in the Middle Ages, if you really wanted to show that you were big and wealthy and powerful, you had to have a lot of land. But now land is becoming less and less important, and money is kind of where it's at. So when we're talking about money, we're talking about like physical currency, like coins and things like that, which we start to see become much more important again. I mean, it was very important during the Roman period, but it sort of died out. So capitalism is going to say, hey, you can open your own business, you can make your own money, and we're actually going to be worried about money itself. So all these new capitalist ideas are quickly going to cause this period of history, this period of economic change anyway, that we call the commercial revolution. So anytime you've got a revolution, you've got a big important change over a relatively short period, and that's kind of what we see here. It's this period of very important, very dramatic change within Europe's economies, so how they're exchanging resources, because now we've got a system that's based on money. So capitalism is very unlike manorialism. Remember, manorialism is what we saw in the Middle Ages, where you as the peasant, you work for your lord, he keeps you safe, you turn over a bunch of the stuff that you produce, and you just keep surviving. Again, capitalism is going to say, hey, you can make your own money, you can make your own profit, and the commercial revolution is going to say that more and more and more money is going to be the most important piece of this whole thing. So now all of a sudden everybody wants money, not just stuff, not just land, because you can get all the land and all the stuff that you want if you have the right amount of money. And so again, we're starting to push Europe more and more into the modern world. Now we've got this much more modernized economy, which is really going to mean a lot when we're talking about this thing that we call the Renaissance. Now, just to quickly wrap up on this point, where does all this money come from? Well, it comes from trade. Trade continues to be the most important source of money within Europe. And basically at this point, there were kind of two main sources of trade. There were two main geographic areas where a lot of this stuff was really going down. And the first big hunk of this is in a region of really what is today northern Germany. Back then it would have been the Holy Roman Empire. But it's this area up in northern Europe. And all of these little different trading cities got together and created this thing called the Hanseatic League. Sometimes historians will refer to it as the Hansa. But the Hanseatic League was sort of this collection of trading cities that were all up in northern Europe. And almost in a guild kind of way, they all worked together. So they would encourage trade with each other. They so it encouraged products to be better. You cut deals for other towns and cities that are in the Hansa, and it actually allowed some of these folks that were up there to become ridiculously wealthy. In fact, there was a brief period of time where there was a family known as the Fugger family. They were German. They were up in northern Germany. And at that point, they became so wealthy through trading on the Hansa that they actually had more money than all the other families in Europe combined for a good chunk of time. So again, the Hanseatic League, it's this trading group, and they can all trade back and forth with each other and make a whole lot of money. But it's not the only source of trade. Because remember, the big focus of trade during this time is going to be on the Mediterranean, because people want all of this stuff from the Middle East. So the place that's going to see some of the best trade in Europe are going to be the city-states of Italy. So Italy at this point didn't really exist. There wasn't really a country that we can call Italy. If you look at the map there that's on the left, I mean, there's not a single color. It looks like somebody ate a box of crayons and kind of threw up on the map. And there's a reason for that. Pretty much after the fall of Rome, Italy never really united. It really never fell under one particular group in the way that, say, France did, or Spain did, or England did, or anything like that. Instead, we had sort of like this little collection of independent city-states and a couple smaller kingdoms and things like that. And each group sort of acted like its own little mini country. I mean, you can kind of think of Athens and Sparta and the ancient Greek city-states, where most of Italy was just off doing its own thing. But Italy was in such a great geographic location that it was almost perfect for trade. Because remember, it's right smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, which means it can control that trade that's going on between Europe and the Middle East. So a lot of these Italian city-states became very wealthy and very powerful. So we start to see some important cities like Venice, like Genoa, like Naples, like Siena, and also like Florence that we're going to talk about too. This is the city of Venice as it exists today. It's an absolutely beautiful city, and it's pretty decently sized considering that it's actually built on top of a lagoon. So I'm sure you've seen photos of this town before. It's incredibly beautiful. I've been there a couple different times. Unfortunately, they're really struggling with rising ocean levels because of climate change. So who knows how much longer Venice will actually be there, which is sad. So if you ever get the chance to go, once we get out of quarantine, and once they get out of quarantine because they're in complete lockdown, definitely worth going to. Venice is an incredible city that really gets its start during this whole period of the commercial revolution and the Renaissance. So let's talk about what this word Renaissance really is, because I keep throwing it out there, but some of you might never have heard it before. So in both Italy and Germany, life is going to really start to change by about 1450. So about 1450, Italy and Germany, especially Italy, really begins to undergo a huge change. You see this change in culture, you see it in technology, you see it in how people think and how people act, and we describe this period as the Renaissance. So Renaissance, it comes from a French word, renaissance, and it literally means rebirth, to be reborn. But what's actually being reborn? Well, we're going back to all that old stuff that we had lost with the fall of Rome. So we're going back to old Greek stuff, old Roman stuff. This is going to mean big changes for art, for literature, for drama, for economics, for technology. All these different things are going to go back to the way that they were, or at least start to go back to the way that they were. Because really, once the Dark Ages had kicked in, Europe had lost all of it. So this is a really big moment for Europe's history. They're going to, finally regain this sense of education and appreciation for art and all these different things that they had under the Romans. But when the Romans fell, all of that just kind of disappeared for a very, very long time. So again, this is just pushing Europe into a much more modern world. So why is it that this starts in Italy? I mean, and again, we see Renaissance stuff happening around Europe, but it's so heavily focused on Italy, pretty much for three big reasons. One, I mean, Italy is the heart of the old Roman Empire, so they still have all that old Roman stuff. They've got Roman buildings, they've got Roman artwork, so they're inspired by the Romans. They see this kind of stuff all the time, so it's pretty easy for them to say, you know what, let's do this. Let's be like them. Secondly, Again, Italy is so fabulously wealthy from trade that it makes it really easy. You know, they've got all the money to do all the stuff that they need to do when it comes to, you know, bringing back education and art and all that. And then thirdly, they're in a great location, not only to exchange goods, but also to exchange ideas. They're right in the middle of the Mediterranean, so they're also right in the middle of Europe. So all the good ideas that start floating around, they all kind of converge on Italy, and Italy will definitely take advantage of that. Now, when it comes to wealth, wealthy people have this funny habit of spending money on things that they want because they can. And so some people during this time really start to support some of these big artists and thinkers. You know, they like the ideas of a particular writer or they like the artwork of a particular artist, so they start to give them money to make stuff for them. And so these supporters, these wealthy people who are giving money out, we start to call them patrons. And very often, if you were an artist during this time or during honestly most of history, artists don't make a whole lot of money unless you've got yourself a big patron. So when we start to talk more about this artwork stuff moving forward, that's going to be a huge deal in this because, you know, people in the Middle Ages weren't buying art. They weren't paying for art to be made unless you were part of the Catholic Church. Now that we're pushing into this new Renaissance and people have money, like they want pretty things. They want a cool statue in their house or a beautiful painting. And this is really where we're going to start to see some of these incredible artists. And most, you know, we talk about Italy being this center of the Renaissance. Well, really, the main focus of the Renaissance is going to be one town in particular, and that's Firenze, or in English, it would be Florence. Florence is an absolutely incredible city that's in northern Italy. They had a lot of very competitive artists that really wanted to try out some new ideas in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s. And also in Florence was a very wealthy and incredibly powerful family known as the Medici. The Medici were very powerful bankers. They had a ton of money. They also had a lot of influence. They had a lot of say with the Pope. There were at least two Medici women who were queens in other countries. So the Medici family, they really had a lot of cash. And when you have all these artists, they could support those artists. So they were very, very good to artists. They acted as important patrons. They gave out huge chunks of money. Also, the Pope, who was nearby in Rome, had a lot of interest in what was going on in Florence, and he would act as a very important patron of some of the artists that were there. So Florence, it's still a great city today. I've been there many times. It's always fun. Florence is really the beating heart of the Renaissance. This is where this whole thing is really going to get started. You know, I've got a couple of images of artwork there at the bottom. That big church that you see with that big dome, that's called the Duomo. Um, it's technically the Basilica of Florence, the Cathedral of Florence. But yeah, I mean, this is where the Renaissance is really going to get its start, is right here in this town. So very quickly, just to kind of wrap up with a little bit of artwork, and then you guys will actually be doing a project early next week on some of this Renaissance art. But art changes a lot during the Renaissance. What I've got right here are four images of different scenes from medieval art. And I'm sure you can tell, like, it's not great. It's not super realistic. It's very symbolic. Everybody looks like they're, you know, pretty flat. They're not moving. I mean, the one in the middle of the king getting baptized in the barrel there, it kind of looks like a cartoon strip. So I mean, this right here is like good medieval art. I'm not even showing you any of the stuff that's not nearly as good. So medieval art is pretty blah, but then you compare that to Renaissance art, and you're going to see something very, very different. You're going to see much more depth. You're going to see much more realism, a lot less symbols. So Renaissance art is really where Europe is moving, particularly in Italy, because of all these new ideas that we're going to start to see in this rebirth of Greek and Roman stuff. So what makes Renaissance art? Because art is going to be such a key piece of the Renaissance. All these artists, especially in Florence, they're going to push away from that old, boring, simple, blah art of the Middle Ages, and they're going to start to see a couple new things. First and foremost, you're going to see this sense of realism. You're going to show things as they really are. No more symbols. You know, don't like if you look back to the images that we had on the medieval page, there was a guy holding keys. Well, that's supposed to be the Apostle Peter holding the keys to heaven. Well, how can you show that without those big goofy keys? Well, maybe you can show him actually at the gates of heaven and opening it up for somebody. You show things as they would actually look, not just with a whole bunch of symbols. Secondly, you see this sense of perfection. The Renaissance artists wanted to show things as being beautiful, as being flawless. And so this is something that the ancient Greeks did quite a bit. It's bringing back that old Greek idea. Let's make things perfect. And then lastly, you get this sense of perspective. So you want to actually add this new technique that makes something look three-dimensional. It has depth. I mean, if you look back to the image that I just showed you, there's a bunch of people in like a big hallway. That's a painting called The School of Athens. You can look back into that painting. It looks like you're looking into a three-dimensional scene, and that's going to be important. Now there is like kind of a fourth thing that I didn't put on this slide, but it's worth mentioning. In Renaissance art, we do suddenly see a lot of nudity again. And that was kind of a big thing because the church was very much against it. They didn't want you to see anybody's parts. But that will come back during the Renaissance period as part of that whole idea of perfection. The human body is something that's beautiful and perfect and should be displayed, according to Renaissance artists. So two most famous artists are where we'll wrap this up here. I'm sure you're familiar with this guy, Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci was an incredible Italian artist. He hung out a lot in Florence, but he wasn't just an artist. He was also an inventor. He was a great mathematician. He came up with all sorts of really cool ideas, everything from how a helicopter could work to a military tank. And he has a lot of very famous pieces of work. The image that's on the left there of the guy in the circle, that's called the Vitruvian Man. I'm sure you recognize Mona Lisa on the top right there. And then also the bottom right is his famous depiction of the Last Supper. So Jesus and his disciples. So Da Vinci is an incredible dude. Again, he's Italian, and he's one of the best Renaissance artists, but also one of the best Renaissance thinkers as well. And we'll play with some more of his ideas later next week too. The other guy who's worth mentioning is Michelangelo. Technically, his whole name is Michelangelo Buonarroti, but Michelangelo is an incredible artist. You've probably seen a lot of his stuff. His most famous, well, one of his most famous works, rather, is what's on the right there. That would be his statue of David, as in the story of like David and Goliath. That's his depiction of David. It's a beautiful sculpture. Michelangelo was himself a trained sculptor. He hated painting. However, one of his other most famous works is most definitely a painting, and that would be the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So Michelangelo was hired by the Pope to paint all of this, even though he hated painting. He did it anyway, and he did a number of other painting projects for the Pope. But we'll look more at Michelangelo and Leonardo moving forward. But just to give you a taste of some of these new things that are happening in the Renaissance, it's going to be a really important moment for European history. So hey, make sure you answer your questions that are tied to this particular unit. We're going to spend more time on the Renaissance and especially Renaissance artists moving forward. But hey, stay happy, stay healthy, and we'll see you guys soon. All right, bye-bye.